It was a bright and sunny morning, the kind that makes you feel like anything is possible. The woman stepped out of her car, dressed in a sharp suit that screamed confidence. She had just wrapped up one of the biggest deals of her life, a deal that would put her company on the map. After months of hard work, sleepless nights, and endless meetings, she finally did it. Her tech startup was now officially a leader in its field. To celebrate this huge milestone, her husband had planned something special, a weekend getaway to the Maldives. And not just any flight. They were flying private. As they walked toward the sleek jet waiting on the tarmac, she couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just about the luxury or the fancy plane, it was about what it represented. This trip was more than just a vacation, it was a reward for all her hard work. For years, she'd faced challenges, doubts, and obstacles, but here she was standing tall, ready to enjoy the fruits of her labor. The jet gleamed under the sunlight, looking every bit as luxurious as promised. As they approached, the pilot emerged from the cockpit. He was a middle-aged man with a stern expression, wearing his uniform perfectly pressed. He greeted her husband with a polite nod and extended his hand. "Good morning, sir," he said, his tone formal and clipped. But then came the moment that stopped her in her tracks. The pilot didn't even glance at her. Not once. It was as if she weren't there. Her heart sank a little, though she tried not to show it. She'd been through situations like this before, times when people underestimated her or treated her differently because of how she looked. But today felt different. She had worked so hard to get where she was, and now, standing next to her husband, she couldn't believe someone could dismiss her so easily. Her husband noticed right away. He saw the way the pilot ignored her completely, focusing only on him. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't say anything, not yet. Instead, he gave her a small, reassuring smile as they boarded the plane. She appreciated the gesture, but deep down, she felt a mix of frustration and sadness bubbling inside her. Once they settled into their seats, she tried to push the incident out of her mind. She reminded herself that this was supposed to be a relaxing trip, a chance to unwind after weeks of stress. But no matter how hard she tried, the memory of the pilot's cold indifference lingered. It gnawed at her, making it impossible to fully relax. As the flight attendants moved around the cabin, preparing for takeoff, she glanced toward the front of the plane. The pilot was busy going over some papers, completely oblivious to the tension brewing in the cabin. Some of the other passengers seemed to notice too. One older woman sitting nearby leaned over and whispered, "That was quite rude, wasn't it?" She forced a polite smile and nodded, unsure of what to say. Part of her wanted to brush it off, to pretend it didn't matter. But another part of her, the part that had fought so hard to earn respect in her career, knew that letting things slide wasn't always the answer. Her husband, sensing her unease, reached over and placed a gentle hand on hers. "Don't worry," he said softly, his voice calm but firm. "Let me handle this." She hesitated for a moment. She was used to handling difficult situations on her own. She prided herself on being strong and independent. But something about the way he said it made her pause. Maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let someone else step in for once. With a deep breath, she nodded. Whatever happened next, she trusted him to do the right thing. Little did she know, this decision would lead to a chain of events that would change everything. For both of them and for the people watching closely from the sidelines. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the atmosphere inside the cabin felt heavier than it should have. The hum of the engines was supposed to bring excitement, a sense of adventure and luxury, but instead, there was an underlying tension that no one could quite ignore. She sat by the window, staring out at the vast expanse of blue sky ahead, trying to distract herself from what had happened earlier. Her husband sat beside her, quiet but alert, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the cockpit door. The pilot soon reappeared to give the pre-flight safety briefing. He stood near the front of the cabin, speaking in a monotone voice as he went through the usual instructions about seat belts, oxygen masks, and emergency exits. But something was off. As he spoke, he looked directly at everyone except her. His gaze skipped over her as though she were invisible, lingering on other passengers instead. It wasn't subtle, it was deliberate. She clenched her fists under, the blanket draped across her lap, forcing herself to stay calm. This isn't personal, she told herself silently. He's just rude to everyone. But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't about rudeness. It was about something deeper, something uglier. And while she tried to convince herself to let it go, the weight of it pressed down on her chest. Other passengers started noticing too. A young couple seated across the aisle exchanged glances when the pilot avoided looking in her direction. An older man sitting nearby raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled by the odd behavior. Even the flight attendants seemed uncomfortable, exchanging quick, knowing looks as they moved around the cabin. One of them, a kind-looking woman with warm eyes, caught her gaze and gave her a small, sympathetic smile. That tiny gesture meant more than words. It reminded her that not everyone saw her the way the pilot did. Her husband leaned closer, his voice low but steady. "Are you okay?" he asked, genuine concern etched on his face. She nodded quickly, brushing off the question with a tight smile. "I'm fine," she replied, though both of them knew it wasn't true. He didn't push her further, respecting her space, but his jaw tightened slightly. Anyone who knew him well would recognize that look. It was the same expression he got whenever someone crossed a line or treated others unfairly. When the briefing ended, the pilot returned to the cockpit without another word. The cabin fell, silent except for the soft murmur of conversations among passengers. She stared out the window again, watching the ground grow smaller as the plane ascended into the clouds. For a moment she thought about saying something, standing up and calling out the pilot's behavior, but doubt crept in. What if people thought she was overreacting? What if they dismissed her concerns because of who she was? Her husband must have sensed her internal struggle. Leaning closer once more, he whispered, "You don't have to fight this alone, you know." She turned to look at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. "What do you mean?" she asked hesitantly. "I mean exactly what I said," he replied, his tone firm but gentle. "If you want me to step in, I will. You shouldn't have to deal with this, not today, not ever." For a second, she felt torn. Part of her wanted to handle it herself, to prove that she could stand up for herself no matter what. But another part of her, the tired, weary part, that had faced similar situations countless times before, felt relief wash over her. Maybe letting him take the lead wouldn't be such a bad thing after all. Maybe, just maybe, it was okay to lean on someone else for support. Taking a deep breath, she finally nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "Do what you think is best." With that, her husband unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. His movements were calm and deliberate, drawing curious glances from nearby passengers. He walked toward the cockpit, knocking firmly on the door. When the pilot opened it, surprise flashed across his face. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, his tone polite but guarded. Her husband stepped inside, closing the door behind him. From where she sat, she couldn't hear their conversation, but she could imagine how it might unfold. She trusted him completely. He had always been her biggest supporter, the person who believed in her when others doubted her abilities. If anyone could address the situation fairly, it was him. Back in the cabin, whispers began to spread among the passengers. Some speculated about what was happening while others simply watched, intrigued by the unfolding drama. The older woman who had commented earlier leaned over to her companion and muttered, "Good for him. Someone needs to say something." Meanwhile, she stayed quiet, her heart pounding in anticipation. She didn't know what her husband planned to say or do, but she trusted him to make things right. Whatever came next, she realized, wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for fairness, for respect, and for the simple principle that no one should be treated differently based on how they look. Minutes ticked by slowly, each one feeling longer than the last. Finally, the cockpit door opened again, and her husband emerged, his expression unreadable. He walked back to his seat, sitting down without a word. Before she could ask what had happened, The intercom crackled to life. A new voice came over the speakers, a different pilot introducing himself and apologizing for the change in plans. Confusion rippled through the cabin. What was going on? Why had the original pilot disappeared so suddenly? All eyes turned to her and her husband, searching for answers. She glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "What did you say to him?" she whispered, half amused, half astonished. He smiled faintly, leaning closer so only she could hear. "Let's just say he won't be flying us anywhere today." And with that, the plane continued its journey, leaving behind the tension that had clouded its start. Though the incident was far from resolved, one thing was clear. Sometimes standing up for what's right isn't just about making noise. It's about taking action, even in the smallest ways. The moment the new pilot's voice came over the intercom, a wave of curiosity swept through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. What had just happened? Why had the original pilot suddenly vanished? The woman, sitting by the window, felt a mix of emotions. Relief that the tension seemed to be easing, but also unease about what her husband might have said or done. She turned to him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What exactly did you tell him?" She asked in a low voice, leaning closer so only he could hear. Her tone was laced with both amusement and concern. She trusted him completely, but she couldn't help wondering how far he'd gone to address the situation. He smiled faintly, his expression calm but resolute. "I just made sure he understood the seriousness of his actions," he replied simply. Then, seeing the look of uncertainty on her face, he added, "Don't worry, I didn't lose my temper or anything like that. I handled it professionally." She nodded slowly, though part of her still wanted to know every detail. But before she could press further, the flight attendants began moving through the cabin again, offering drinks and snacks. The interruption gave her a chance to collect her thoughts. She leaned back in her seat, staring out the window at the endless expanse of clouds below. Despite the change in pilots, the weight of what had happened earlier still lingered in the air. Back in the cockpit, the replacement pilot, a younger man with a friendly demeanor, was already settling into his role. He seemed genuinely apologetic for the disruption, addressing the passengers warmly over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally apologize for the unexpected change in our flight crew. Please rest assured that your safety and comfort remain our top priorities. If there's anything you need during this journey, don't hesitate to let us know." His words were reassuring, and the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. Some passengers visibly relaxed, sipping their drinks or flipping through magazines. Others, however, remained curious about the events that had unfolded. A few even approached the flight attendants discreetly, asking questions about what had happened. One elderly gentleman, seated near the front, leaned over to ask, "Is everything all right? Was there some kind of issue with the first pilot?" The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure how much he was allowed to share. "There was a misunderstanding," she said carefully, choosing her words with precision. "But it has been resolved, and we're continuing as planned. Thank you for your understanding." Though vague, her response satisfied most people. After all, they were on a luxurious private jet heading to paradise. It wasn't long before the allure of the destination took over, distracting them from the drama that had briefly interrupted their trip. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, the woman found herself reflecting on the incident. She replayed the scene in her mind. The way the original pilot had ignored her, the awkwardness of the safety briefing, and now, the swift removal of the man who had caused such discomfort. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered prejudice in her life, but this particular experience felt different. Maybe it was because she was surrounded by strangers who witnessed it firsthand, or maybe it was because she hadn't been the one to confront it directly. Whatever the reason, it left her feeling conflicted. Her husband noticed her quiet contemplation and placed a reassuring hand on hers. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice filled with genuine care. She glanced at him, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, I'm fine," she replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "It's just frustrating, you know? I work so hard to prove myself, to earn respect in my field. And then something like this happens. It makes me wonder if it ever really matters." He listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "Of course it matters," he said firmly. "Everything you've achieved matters, not just to me, but to everyone who looks up to you. You can't let someone else's ignorance diminish that. And besides," he paused, giving her hand a gentle squeeze, "that's why I stepped in, because you shouldn't have to fight these battles alone." Her eyes softened, touched by his unwavering support. For years he had stood by her side, celebrating her successes and helping her navigate challenges. Whether it was dealing with difficult clients, overcoming setbacks, or facing moments of self-doubt, he had always been there. But today, his actions went beyond mere encouragement. They were a reminder that standing up against injustice wasn't just her responsibility, it was something they could do together. As the plane soared higher into the sky, the initial tension gradually faded. Outside, the world stretched endlessly beneath them, oceans, mountains, and cities blending into a breathtaking tapestry of colors. Inside, conversations resumed, laughter echoed through the cabin, and the earlier awkwardness became a distant memory for most passengers. Yet for her, the incident remained fresh in her mind, a stark reminder of the biases that still existed in the world. Curiosity eventually got the better of her, and she decided to ask her husband more about what had transpired in the cockpit. "So, seriously," she began, keeping her voice light, "what did you say to make him step down so quickly?" He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Well, I didn't threaten him or anything dramatic like that," he explained. "I just pointed out that his behavior was unacceptable, that treating someone the way he treated you isn't just disrespectful, it's unprofessional. And then—" He hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to reveal the next part. "And then?" she prompted, raising an eyebrow. "I reminded him who I am," he admitted, his tone matter-of-fact. "And let's just say when certain connections come into play, people tend to listen." She stared at him, momentarily stunned. While she appreciated his efforts to resolve the situation, she couldn't help feeling a pang of guilt. "Do you think it was necessary to pull rank like that?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "I mean, I don't want anyone thinking I needed someone else to fight my battles for me." He understood her hesitation immediately. "Listen," he said gently, "this wasn't about pulling rank for its own sake. It was about sending a message that no one gets a free pass to act like that, especially not in a position of authority. Besides, sometimes it takes more than just words to make people realize the impact of their actions." She considered his explanation, nodding slowly. Deep down, she knew he was right. There was power in calling out bad behavior, and sometimes leveraging influence was the fastest way to effect change. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the incident would follow her long after the flight ended. By the time dinner was served, the mood in the cabin had shifted entirely. The replacement pilot proved to be warm and engaging, making occasional announcements that kept everyone entertained. The flight attendants worked tirelessly to ensure the passengers felt pampered, serving gourmet meals and refilling glasses with sparkling water and wine. Laughter bubbled up around them, and for a while, it felt like the earlier drama had never happened. Yet, as she sat there, enjoying the luxury of the private jet, she realized that moments like these stayed with you. They shaped your perspective, tested your resilience, and reminded you of the importance of standing up, not just for yourself, but for others too. And while the day had started with frustration and indignation, it had evolved into something else entirely. A lesson in courage, allyship, and the power of speaking out when it mattered most. As the flight continued smoothly under the guidance of the new pilot, the woman found herself reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The luxury of the private jet, the stunning views outside the window, and the attentive service from the flight attendants were all designed to make passengers feel pampered and relaxed. But for her, the incident with the original pilot lingered in the back of her mind like an unwelcome shadow. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here, something beyond just one man's poor judgment. Her husband, sensing her quiet contemplation, leaned over and whispered, "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" His tone was gentle, almost as if he already knew the answer before she even spoke. She sighed softly, nodding. "It's not just about what happened," she admitted, keeping her voice low so only he could hear. "It's about everything. You know? This kind of thing happens all the time, but most people don't speak up. They either ignore it or brush it off because it's easier. And honestly, sometimes I do the same. But today felt different." He listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "Different how?" "I guess." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I guess it's because this time, someone else stepped in. Someone who wasn't directly affected by it. That doesn't happen often. People usually stay silent unless it impacts them personally." Her husband nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant. "That's why I did it," he said simply. "Because standing up for what's right shouldn't depend on whether or not it affects you directly. If we wait for things to hit close to home, nothing will ever change." His words struck a chord with her. It was true. Change rarely happened without action, and action often required courage. In that moment, she realized how much his decision to confront the pilot meant, not just to her but to anyone else who might have witnessed the exchange. For the other passengers on the plane, especially those who noticed the snubbing, seeing someone take a stand sent a powerful message. It reminded them that speaking out against injustice wasn't just possible, it was necessary. Later that evening, after dinner trays had been cleared away and the cabin lights dimmed slightly, the woman decided to check her phone for the first time since boarding. She had intentionally avoided social media earlier, wanting to focus on the trip and leave the stress of work behind. But now, curiosity got the better of her. As soon as she unlocked her screen, notifications began flooding in. Messages, comments, and tags from friends and colleagues. At first, she assumed it was related to her recent business deal. After all, closing such a major contract was bound to attract attention. But as she scrolled through the posts, she quickly realized something else was going on. One of the passengers on the plane, a young woman seated a few rows ahead, had tweeted about the incident. Her tweet described the original pilot's behavior, the confrontation in the cockpit, and the subsequent removal of the man from duty. Within hours, the post had gone viral, sparking heated discussions online. Hashtags like the Respect for All and Yashkin Stand Against Bias began trending, with thousands of people chiming in to share their thoughts. Some praised the couple for addressing the issue head-on, while others expressed outrage at the pilot's actions. A few even shared their own stories of facing similar discrimination in various settings. The woman stared at her phone, stunned by the sudden wave of attention. She hadn't expected any of this. To her, the incident had been personal, a fleeting moment of disrespect that she hoped to move past quickly. But now it seemed it had become something much bigger. Social media had amplified the story, turning it into a rallying cry for fairness and equality. Her husband noticed her reaction and glanced at her phone. "What is it?" he asked, concern flickering across his face. She handed him the device, letting him read through the tweets. He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the extent of the response. "Wow," he muttered, scrolling further. "I didn't think anyone would post about it." "Neither did I," she replied, shaking her head. "But here we are." For a moment they sat in silence, processing the situation. On one hand, the widespread support was heartening. It showed that people cared deeply about issues of bias and discrimination, and that many were willing to amplify voices calling for change. On the other hand, the sudden spotlight made her uneasy. She wasn't used to being the center of public attention, especially not for something so personal. While she appreciated the messages of solidarity, she couldn't help wondering if the focus on her story overshadowed the broader issue at hand. Her husband seemed to sense her unease. "This isn't about us anymore," he said gently. "It's about the conversation it's starting. People are using this as an opportunity to talk about systemic problems, Problems that won't go away unless we keep pushing for accountability. She nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in his words. Still, the weight of responsibility felt heavy. She didn't ask to become a symbol of anything, but now that she was, she knew she couldn't ignore it entirely. The question was, what should she do next? Back in the aviation industry, news of the incident spread rapidly. The charter company responsible for the flight issued a formal apology, acknowledging the pilot's misconduct and confirming that he had been terminated immediately. They also promised to implement stricter diversity training programs for all employees, emphasizing the importance of treating every passenger with dignity and respect. The statement was met with mixed reactions online. Some applauded the company for taking swift action, while others criticized them for waiting until the situation blew up publicly before addressing it. Meanwhile, the replacement pilot took the opportunity to connect with the passengers during the flight. During a brief break in his duties, he stepped out of the cockpit to introduce himself personally. "I just wanted to thank you all for your patience today," he said warmly, addressing the cabin. "Flying should be an experience where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case earlier, and for that I truly apologize." His words resonated with many of the passengers, including the woman. There was sincerity in his voice, a genuine desire to make amends for something he hadn't caused but still felt responsible for addressing. Afterward, several people approached him to express their gratitude, thanking him for stepping in when it mattered most. By the time the plane began its descent toward the Maldives, the atmosphere inside the cabin had transformed completely. What had started as a tense and uncomfortable journey had evolved into something meaningful, a reminder that even small acts of courage could spark larger conversations about fairness and respect. For the woman, the trip was no longer just about celebrating her success. It had become an opportunity to reflect on the power of standing up for what's right, both individually and collectively. As the wheels touched down on the runway, she glanced at her husband, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You know," she said softly, "this wasn't how I imagined our vacation would start, but maybe it's exactly what needed to happen." He smiled back, squeezing her hand gently. Sometimes the best memories are the ones you never see coming. The plane touched down gently on the runway, the wheels kissing the tarmac with a soft thud. The woman looked out the window at the lush greenery and turquoise waters of the Maldives stretching out before her. It was breathtaking, a paradise that promised relaxation and escape. But as she stepped off the plane into the warm tropical air, she couldn't help but feel like this trip had already taken on a deeper meaning. What was supposed to be a celebration of her hard-earned success had turned into something far more significant, a moment that sparked conversations about respect, fairness, and standing up against prejudice. Her husband walked beside her, carrying their bags as they made their way toward the luxurious resort waiting for them. He could sense the mix of emotions swirling inside her: pride, frustration, gratitude, and maybe even a little uncertainty. "You're quiet," he said softly, glancing over at her. "What's going through your mind?" She hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I guess I'm still processing everything," she admitted. "This whole thing, and it wasn't just about me or us. It became bigger than that. And now people are watching. They're expecting something from me, something I'm not sure I'm ready for." He nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "It's okay to feel overwhelmed," he reassured her. "But remember, you don't have to figure it all out right away. Take your time. Focus on what feels right for you." She appreciated his calmness, his ability to ground her when things felt chaotic. Still, the weight of the situation lingered. Over the next few days, as they settled into the rhythm of island life, she found herself scrolling through social media during quiet moments. The hashtags "Respect for All" and "Stand Against Bias" were still trending, with thousands of posts pouring in daily. People shared stories of discrimination they'd faced in airports, airplanes, and other public spaces. Others praised her husband for stepping in and holding the pilot accountable. Some messages were directed specifically at her, thanking her, for inspiring others to speak up. At first, reading these comments filled her with a strange mix of pride and discomfort. She hadn't set out to inspire anyone. She'd simply been living her life trying to navigate the challenges that came with it. But as the days passed, she began to see the potential in this unexpected spotlight. Maybe this was an opportunity, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever felt overlooked or dismissed because of how they looked. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, she sat on the beach with her husband. The sound of waves lapping against the shore created a soothing backdrop as they talked. "I've been thinking," she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "about what happened on the plane, about the messages I've been getting, about everything." He turned to look at her, giving her his full attention. "And I think I want to do something about it," she continued, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Not just sit back and let it blow over. This isn't just my story. It's part of a much bigger conversation. And if people are listening, maybe I can use this platform to make a difference." Her husband smiled, his eyes lighting up with pride. "That's incredible," he said. "What do you have in mind?" "Well," she paused, gathering her thoughts. "I've always believed in lifting others up, especially women and minorities who face barriers in industries like aviation. Maybe I can partner with organizations that support diversity in those fields, start mentorship programs, scholarships, or workshops, something that helps create opportunities for people who might not otherwise get them." As she spoke, her excitement grew. For years, she'd focused on building her own career, breaking through glass ceilings and proving herself in a world that often underestimated her. Now she saw a chance to extend a hand to others, to help pave the way for the next generation. It wasn't just about addressing the incident on the plane anymore. It was about creating lasting change. Over the course of their stay in the Maldives, she began sketching out ideas for her initiative. She reached out to advocacy groups and industry leaders, sharing her vision and asking for advice. To her surprise, many were eager to collaborate. One organization suggested launching a campaign to highlight the achievements of trailblazers in aviation, people who had overcome obstacles to succeed in a field where they were underrepresented. Another proposed hosting panel discussions and networking events to connect aspiring professionals with mentors who could guide them. By the time they boarded the return flight home, she had a clear plan in place. The charter company, eager to make amends for the earlier incident, offered to sponsor part of the initiative. They also invited her to speak at an upcoming conference on diversity and inclusion in aviation. It was surreal. Just weeks ago, she had been an ordinary passenger, and now she was being asked to lead a movement. On the flight back, the atmosphere was completely different. The replacement pilot greeted everyone warmly, including her, making a point to acknowledge each passenger individually. She noticed the subtle shift in tone among the crew as well. They seemed genuinely committed to ensuring everyone felt respected and valued. It was a small but meaningful step forward. When they landed, the real work began. She threw herself into organizing the initiative, working tirelessly to bring her vision to life. Within months, the program gained traction, attracting participants from around the world. Stories of young women and minorities finding inspiration and guidance through the mentorship efforts started pouring in. One participant, a teenage girl from a small town, wrote to thank her for showing her that a career in aviation was possible, even though no one in her community had ever done it before. Another shared how the scholarship she received allowed her to pursue training she couldn't afford on her own. Seeing these transformations unfold gave her a profound sense of fulfillment. Yes, the incident on the plane had been painful, but it had also ignited something powerful, a ripple effect of change that extended far beyond her personal experience. She realized that sometimes life throws challenges your way not to break you, but to shape you into someone capable of making a difference. Her husband watched her transformation with admiration. "You know," he said one evening as they sat together at home reflecting on everything that had happened, "this whole journey has shown me something important." "What's that?" she asked, curious. "That you're unstoppable," he replied with a grin. "No matter what comes your way, you turn it into something meaningful. You inspire people without even trying." She laughed, shaking her head. "I didn't do this alone," she reminded him. "None of this would have happened without you standing by me, and without everyone else who believed in the cause." Nodded, acknowledging her point. "True. But don't underestimate the power of leading by example. People see what you've done and feel empowered to take action too. That's how movements grow." As they sat there, surrounded by mementos from their trip and notes from grateful participants in the initiative, she felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. But she knew one thing for certain. Standing up for what's right wasn't just about fighting battles. It was about building bridges. And together they were doing just that. One step, one story, and one person at a time. Months had passed since that fateful flight, but the impact of what had happened continued to ripple outward. The woman and her husband had returned from their vacation with a renewed sense of purpose. What started as a personal experience on a private jet had grown into something much larger, a movement aimed at creating fairness and opportunity in an industry where bias often went unchallenged. For her, it wasn't about seeking revenge or pointing fingers anymore. It was about making sure no one else felt invisible or dismissed because of who they were. The initiative she launched quickly gained momentum. It began with small steps: workshops for young women interested in aviation, mentorship programs connecting experienced professionals with newcomers, and partnerships with organizations dedicated to diversity. But soon, those small steps turned into giant leaps. Major airlines started reaching out, eager to support her efforts. Schools across the country introduced curriculum changes inspired by her work, encouraging students from underrepresented communities to dream bigger and aim higher. Even government bodies took notice, pledging funding to expand training programs for minority groups in aviation. One of the most rewarding aspects of the journey was hearing directly from those who benefited from the program. Letters poured in daily, each one telling a unique story of hope and transformation. A young man from a low-income neighborhood wrote about how attending one of the workshops gave him the confidence to apply for pilot school, a path he never thought possible growing up. A single mother shared how the scholarship helped her complete her certification as a flight attendant, allowing her to provide a better life for her children. These stories reminded her why she had decided to take action in the first place. Not just for herself, but for everyone who deserved a fair shot. Her husband remained her biggest cheerleader throughout the process. He attended events alongside her, offering advice when needed and stepping back when she wanted to lead independently. Their partnership was built on mutual respect and trust, and it showed in everything they did together. "You've always been unstoppable," he told her one evening after a particularly successful fundraising gala. "But watching you inspire others? That's next level." She smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she replied honestly. "You stood by me when I doubted myself, and you pushed me to keep going even when things felt overwhelming." He shrugged modestly. "All I did was remind you of what you already knew. You're stronger than you think." As time went on, the couple found themselves invited to speak at conferences, panel discussions, and interviews. At first, she felt nervous about being in the spotlight. Public speaking wasn't something she'd ever imagined doing regularly. But with practice and plenty of encouragement from her husband, she grew more comfortable sharing her story. Each speech became less about her personal experience and more about the broader message. That change is possible when people come together to demand it. One of the highlights of their advocacy journey came during a global aviation summit held in Europe. She was asked to deliver the keynote address, standing before hundreds of industry leaders, policymakers, and innovators. As she walked onto the stage, the room erupted in applause, a mix of admiration and gratitude for the work she'd done. Looking out at the sea of faces, she felt a surge of emotion. This moment wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had supported her along the way. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "When I stepped onto that plane months ago, I never imagined my life would take such a dramatic turn. All I wanted was to celebrate a hard-earned achievement with the person I love. Instead, I found myself facing a situation that forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and inequality. She paused, scanning the audience. Some people nodded in understanding, while others leaned forward, hanging on her every word. What happened that day could have ended there, she continued, but instead it sparked a conversation that has since grown into action. Because sometimes it only takes one moment to realize that silence isn't an option. By the end of her speech, the entire room was on its feet, cheering loudly. Many attendees approached her afterward, thanking her for shining a light on issues they had long ignored. One airline executive promised to implement stricter anti-discrimination policies within his company. Another pledged to sponsor additional scholarships for underrepresented groups. The energy in the room was electric, filled with promises of progress and collaboration. Back home, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be given everything that had transpired. The couple continued balancing their careers, family, and advocacy work, finding joy in the little victories along the way. They celebrated milestones like the launch of a new mentorship program or the graduation of a student whose dreams had once seemed impossible. Every success reinforced their belief that standing up for what's right wasn't just about fighting battles, it was about building bridges. On their anniversary, they decided to revisit the Maldives, returning to the same resort where their journey toward advocacy had truly begun. Sitting on the beach, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she reflected on how far they'd come. "Do you remember that first night we sat here?" she asked, turning to her husband with a smile. He chuckled softly. "How could I forget? You were still processing everything, trying to figure out what to do next. And look at us now," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "Who would have thought one bad experience could lead to so much good?" "It wasn't just the experience," he reminded her gently. "It was your decision to turn it into something meaningful. That's what made all the difference." She reached over, taking his hand in hers. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" "The best," he agreed, squeezing her hand tightly. As they sat there surrounded by the beauty of the island, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the challenges that had shaped her, for the love and support of her husband, and for the countless individuals who had joined them in the fight for equality. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she knew one thing for certain. As long as they kept standing together, anything was possible.